Very good introduction. I started this company called Motor City Brewing Works in 2009, and I was finishing on my MBA at Walsh College, and I was kind of at that fork in the road. And I'd worked corporately in sales and marketing for Kimberly-Clark and Velasquez at one point, and decided that I liked the beer industry, but I didn't like to make beer, and I didn't want to start a brewery. So what do you do? So I liked going to breweries, and I sure liked drinking it. So I hatched this idea with a business partner to put a bunch of people on a bus and take them to breweries. And we would do beer samples and tours and get the whole VIP treatment. And that was the initial idea. Little did I know that would grow into a full-time job and eventually a book deal and speaking engagements and lots of fun stuff. I consider myself pretty lucky. Since I started, I've taken over 20,000 people to Michigan breweries. All I do is go to Michigan breweries. I don't do anything out of state. I don't go to wineries. I don't go to distilleries. I go to breweries. I don't go to dive bars. I don't do any of that, right? Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that is definitely a question I get asked all the time. So I'm totally ready to answer it. So I have a lot of fun. So I started with bus tours in 2009. I was also an avid bicycle rider. And I wanted to take some of my love of Detroit history and intertwine that with beer and bikes. And that developed bike and brew tours, which I do in the summer. And in the summer, I do 30 bike tours in downtown Detroit that are small group, 15 to 20 people bike tours, and it's themed on a certain type of history. And it all started with beer history. I read this awesome book called Brewed in Detroit. And I read that book and said, wow, I could bike people to some of those places, and then I could tell some stories, and then we'll drink beer at the end and it'd be a lot of fun. And I thought I'd do that 2 times, was what I told my wife. I'm gonna create this, we're gonna do this twice, a couple people might show up, and if not, we're gonna drink at the end, and who cares? And the first tour we had 30 people, which was a little too much, and from that point forward, we just were like a rocket. And the first season we did the bike tours, one route, which was beer history, I did it 20 times to 20 sold out crowds. It was crazy. And I used every friend I ever had to help me get through the first summer, because I didn't plan it that way. We just ran out of weekends, and most people's complaint was that they couldn't get on a tour by the end of the summer. So then I rolled into the next summer, and I said, well, wow, I need to do more history. So then I delved into Prohibition history and created a whole second route with the whole concept of biking people to Belle Isle and back, from Midtown to Belle Isle and back. So I partnered with Traffic Jam and Snug, which is the first brew pub in Michigan, and that's exactly what we did. And now both of those routes are still just as popular, and I've done 7 seasons, and now 40% of the business is all tied into just bike tours. So I've had a lot of fun doing that. So bus, bike, walk. I do a couple events on the Detroit Princess Riverboat. In a given year, I do about 85 tours. I've probably worked with 50 different breweries now, and it's been a blast. So, but out of this book, I've gone into lots of different subject matters. So I know a lot about auto history now, maybe not as much as Mike, but I definitely have created 3 different bike tours about auto history, Corktown, Lexington history, public art, things like that. So I know a little bit about a lot of things now, but I know the most about beer history, and that's definitely what I'd love to share with you guys tonight. You ready? Yeah. I know I didn't bring beer. I already got those questions. I know. Not supposed to, so.
You got any in the car?
Well, you know what the fun thing was? I did a podcast this afternoon. I run 2 different podcasts for Podcast Detroit. And one's called The Beer Tour Guy Show. That's who I am. And I interviewed the owner of Liberty Street Brewery in Plymouth. And then he brought a whole bunch of beer to it. So we're sitting there cracking open beers at 1 o'clock this afternoon. I'm like, hey, I have to go do a talk later. So I appreciate it if I wasn't completely red in the face while I do that. So I hold myself back. And then the wife brings dinner home. Well, what does she want to do? Well, she cracks open a beer. And I'm like, nope, I'm having milk. So you get me fresh is what I'm getting at. Okay? All right. So the way I usually do this is about the first third of the book is really the early history of breweries in Detroit. And that's what I like to share. Though the other 2/3, as Mike alluded to, is about craft beer history. I really only talk a little bit about that at the end. And that's if you're interested and want me to keep talking. So typically when you have speakers, about how long do they go?
45 to
45,
hour,
four and a half.
and then,
4.5 hours. So
I told the
45
kid to be
minutes
turned in by
for-
9:30, that's.
Okay. Then that's what I'll live within. So this was originally designed for a talk I did at Macomb Community College, their SOAR program, which is Society of Active Retirees. Have you ever heard of that program? And they bring in speakers. That was a 2-hour setup that I created this for. So I will talk a little faster at times, but feel free to ask me questions. I expect to have a pretty educated group in here that probably knows a decent amount about history already. So let's start. So the beginning of breweries in Detroit started in the 1830s and 40s. And you had your initial waves of immigrants coming in Detroit. So you had English, Irish, and Scottish immigrants coming into the city. And with that, they brought their local culture, their cuisine, and their love of ales. So all beer is ales and lagers. So we start with English, Irish, and Scottish. They bring ales over. They introduce those styles of beer. And those are easier styles of beer to brew. Does anyone know why? Because you can mask imperfections in them a lot easier. So in the 1830s and 40s, they start coming here and doing ales. In 1837, the first ad is listed, and it's called the Davis and Moore Brewery. And because there was no licensing for breweries at that time, that's considered the first brewery to open in Detroit. There probably were breweries that opened before then, but that's the one on record because it showed up in the paper. So Davis and Moore Brewery opened in what would be considered the Greektown area. And pretty quickly, within about 10 years, you had 40 active breweries in downtown Detroit. Think about that. That's pretty amazing, 40. Now we have about 40 in all of Metro Detroit, and that's as we're in the wave 3 of craft breweries right now. So 40 in the 1840s. Remember it like that, starting with the Davis and Moore Brewery. So the next phase came with what type of immigrants do you think came here in the 1850s and 60s? Germans, very good. What style of beer do Germans like? Lagers, there we go. So English, Irish, and Scottish are ales. Those are easier to brew because they can hide stuff. Lagers are not like that. Germans introduced lagers really to the whole United States, definitely in the Detroit area, and they built some of the larger breweries that I'll definitely speak of tonight. So clean lagers, they brought quality brewing technology. They brought all kinds of things that the English, Irish, and Scottish weren't doing. So consider the English, Irish, and Scottish kind of the brew pubs of the 1830s and 40s. And then big beer would have been considered the Germans eventually when they came in the 1850s and 60s. So as we get into the early 1900s, what's already starting to happen in the U.S.?
Prohibition.
The onset of what will eventually become Prohibition is starting now. I just realized I'm using slides and I didn't advance anything. So, okay. I just said all that. I'll get better, I promise. This isn't the first time I've done this, but okay. So, Prohibition. So in Michigan, what year did Prohibition hit Michigan? 1918.
There it is.
With the passing of the state amendment known as the Damon Act. So they signed it into law in 1917, and then they started enforcing it in 1918. So there was a 1-year lag.
With Canada a mile away, it didn't matter anyway.
It didn't, but that's like a whole different part of the conversation, right? This isn't a prohibition
I know.
speech at all, definitely. And I could do a whole different talk on just that subject. But so in 1918, the Damon Act is passed. But from 1917 to 1918, if you were a licensed bar and saloon, you could stockpile booze, and you were legally allowed to sell it after 1918 because you had purchased it, gotten it before then. So Detroit Athletic Club, how many people are familiar with that? They stockpiled 7 years worth of alcohol. I don't know how they figured that out, but somewhere they said, all right, you're 2 drinks every time you come in here, and you come here twice a week. Okay, so they did some math there, and they figured out 7 years worth.
Wow.
So 1918, we're in Prohibition already. The rest of the nation was 1920 with the passing of the 18th Amendment. So 18th Amendment, we always say that's the bad amendment. We don't like that one, do we? Right? So I kind of got 2 pictures right here. I got the last call picture, and then I got where we really start our next phase of beer history talk, which is this awesome picture here. This is Victory Day. So when is Prohibition repealed? Well, it's actually, if you really read it on there. Yeah, it's right on there. It's kind of hard to see. It's pretty hard to see it. But if you look right there, that says May 10th, 1933. It's really May 11th, 1933 is what we call the beer part of Prohibition is repealed. The rest of Prohibition is repealed on what we call Repeal Day. Does anyone know that date? The day before my birthday. Does anyone know the day before my birthday? I'm just really impressed if you knew that. I'm just kidding. December 5th. So most people celebrate Repeal Day, but forget that the beer part of it was May 11th of the same year. So as beer drinkers, we care about this. So why does that say May 10th? Because at midnight, they were throwing this party and they tapped the first legal beer, and Stroh was right at the onset of it. They were there ready to sell beer at Victory Day at this American Legion convention to kick off legal beer flowing again in Detroit. Guess how many?
So this convention's going on at midnight just because of that?
Wow, it was at the American Legion Convention Hall.
Okay.
Let me say it that way. The convention wasn't going on. Thank you. So how many beers do you think they went through? 1,000 people in attendance.
Oh, jeez.
12-ounce beers. We'll use it as 12-ounce, regular-sized beer. How many beers do you think they went through in one night?
2,000.
62,000.
The boys are hard.
We have a lot of hangovers.
Thirsty. Wow.
Those are some major hangovers.
That was only like 3 years for the Detroit Athletic Club. But yeah, that was all in one night. Pretty amazing. And Stroh was kind of at the heart of that. So I'll talk about Stroh kind of on the back end of my talk today. So let's start with all these guys in here. Okay? I love having a way to show you some labels right up here. But when you guys are done, you might have noticed I have some labels here, and I have some labels here. Some of these are featured in the book, not all of them. I collect beer labels now. That's a challenge.
And did you start because it was cheaper than buying photographs for the book?
It was, that's what I figured out. So that's what I told my wife at least 100 times. As packages kept showing up from eBay, I'd be like, honey, this is for the book project. And then I showed up at my mom's house with like 100 beer labels, and then she took her camera and did high-res pictures of each of those, of which we featured some of them in the book. And that was our cheaper way to get historical things in the book than getting rights to pictures. Like this picture, and this picture, I couldn't legally show that. So I think that's the Detroit News that owns that one. That's a real famous picture. So okay, so let's talk about a couple different breweries on here. Let's start with Polish breweries. Does that sound good? How many Polacks do I have in here? A couple? Okay, I am, that's why I say it that way. So I don't mean any disrespect to that. So there were 4 Polish breweries that came out of Prohibition. There was Wayne Brewing, there was Zutowski Brewing, and then there's 2 I got featured up here. There was Auto City Brewing Company, and there was Zenda Brewing Company. Let's start with Auto City. Sounds the most Detroit of all of these. Auto City Brewing Company started in 1910 from the Kronowski, I feel like I never say this right, Kronowski brothers. And they located their brewery right across the street from the Dodge main plant. Does anyone remember where that is? Yeah, sounds pretty smart. Like when I say it, like, oh yeah, I get it. I would do that too. Right? Yeah. So where the GM Hamtramck, Whole Town, Detroit Hamtramck Edge. Yeah. So that got absorbed in that property. See, I knew I had a real smart crowd. So normally I'd say that knowing to know what I'm talking about. So they did it across the street from the Dodge main plant. It was Auto City Brewing Company. They started in 1910. Obviously, they had to close during Prohibition, and then in 1933 they reopened again. And their claim to fame was they were the beer with vitamin B in it.
Oh yeah.
So,
Right up.
So how can they say stuff like that? So you can make health claims to beer. This is before the FDA was involved, before you had labeling laws that came in there. If you look at early labels, all these labels are really good examples of that. Theirs had the vitamin B in it, so it's better for you. So there'd be all these healthy claims. Think about Guinness for strength ads when you think about Irish beer. Same exact concept. All these breweries did things like that. So I'll kind of give you an example of those for each of these. A bunch of these make those same types of claims. So in their peak, Auto City Brewing Company brewed 75,000 barrels of beer. And that's a lot in a year. It doesn't sound a lot after I talk about that party and I said 62,000 in one night, but it really is a lot of beer. Anyone know how many gallons are in a barrel? 31 gallons in a barrel, or about 310 beers per barrel. And you say 75,000 barrels, that's a lot. Or say that another way. Let's see, Atwater Brewery right now, they're probably around the 40,000 barrel mark. And they've been around for 20 years now. So think about this, a couple years out of Prohibition, boom, we're already doing 75,000 barrels of beer a year. So more beer drinkers, and they were drinking a lot more. The per capita is very different now than it was then. So that's Auto City Brewing. They made it all the way to 1941, and then boom, they were gone. They didn't sell out, they didn't merge with anybody, they just closed up. So the other of the famous 4 Polish breweries was Zenda's. That's on the far side here with that ram thing going at it. So Zenda was probably a little more well known. Has anyone ever been to Sweetest Heart of Mary Church? Yes?
It's my
Yes?
I'm parishioner there. Yeah.
Oh, well, okay, then you've definitely been there. I always go to the Pierogi Festival every year. So that's on Canfield and
Russell.
Huh?
Russell and Kid.
Well, yeah, I guess it is Russell, isn't it? If Russell went through. What's directly across the street from there?
An empty park, but I mean.
The park. So, did you know that used to be where Zenda Brewing Company was located? And Zenda Brewing Company started as the White Eagle Brewery. And that does sound Polish, doesn't it? When you think of that logo. And post-Prohibition, they had a large space in that park they continued to expand on. The brothers were originally involved in the business, John Zenda Sr. and his brothers, and then eventually his sons got involved. John Zenda Sr. was politically connected in the Hamtramck area. If you know anything about Prohibition history, where was the wettest area during Prohibition? It was Hamtramck. They had the largest concentration of speakeasies and blind pigs. So if you're politically connected, and you also own a brewery, those are two really good things during Prohibition. So yes, you're not supposed to be producing beer. So what did they do? So they built a tunnel that went from the brewery kitty corner to where you mentioned there were apartments. That used to be a hardware store in there at one point. And they'd have lookouts, and they had this whole storage area over in there. So through the tunnel, they would get this. So they would send out a truck, and that would have near beer going to wherever they sold near beer. And that would take the cops with it. And then someone would say, the coast is clear, across the street at the hardware store. Garage door would open up, another truck would come out with regular Zenda lager, and that would go to all the speakeasies in the Hamtramck area. Because John Zenda Sr. was so politically connected, they turned a blind eye to that, and Zenda flourished. And then boom, we repealed Prohibition. Great, we're flush with money now because we've been selling beer during Prohibition. So they're able to start up right away. And within a couple of years, they're doing about 50,000 barrels of beer in a year. And very similar to Auto City, they made it to the 1940s before they closed up shop. And like Auto City, the family did not want to expand and get larger, and that family didn't sell. So eventually, different uses came into that brewery property, and then it was demolished in the 1970s, eventually became that park, and that's what it is today. And at least they mow it now. So that's a big plus. I'm sure you must like that part of it. My first couple of years of doing bike tours, we always used Canfield to cut through to other parts of Detroit, and we go right by that area. And when I want to talk about Zenda, I never wanted to stop right exactly in front of the park because the weeds were like this high. I was always afraid like a bear or something was going to come out of it. And then that was going to end up on Yelp, and then I was never going to get to do a bike tour again, and that would have been just horrible. So, okay, so that was the Auto City Zenda. That's kind of the Polish part of this story. So let's talk about a couple of these other breweries that were in the Eastern Market area. Let's start with these guys right here. America's Finest Beer, Schmidt's. It's a very common brewery name. So Schmidt Brewing Company was on Orleans Street. So if you know the Eastern Market area, if you know where Russell and Wilkins is, if you take Wilkins, and I'm giving the wrong address here, I apologize. It's on Wilkins Street, the other side of the DeQuindercut Greenway, before you get to St. Albert. And there's still part of a brown building there, but it's not obvious that it used to be a brewery. I wish I actually had a really good old picture of it. It was a 5-story structure that was there at one point, but they started in early 1900s, And then during Prohibition, they changed the name to kind of a funny name. A lot of breweries took out the word brewing in the name and they added the word products in there. So Stroh Products Company. Schmidt Products Company? No, that's not what they did. Acme Beverage Company. And they played Looney Tunes and they did all those fun. No, I'm just kidding. They made soft drinks and they made this really interesting product. It was called hop flavored malt syrup. What do you think you'd do with that?
Make your own.
Make beer.
Make
your own
beer.
beer.
That's right. They would advertise it as baking product, but it was really an extract kit for making beer. Because during Prohibition, legally, you could sell people ways to make beer, sell people ways to make wine, and you could make that in your home. You just couldn't transport it anywhere or sell it. That's the way the law worked. So all these breweries did things like that. Stroh did the same thing, and it would be like a pitcher, and it would look like your grandma mixing something up. But your grandma was really mixing up beer. And it was being sold by brewers to your grandma for you to drink beer in your home. You just couldn't take it anywhere. That's all. So Schmidt comes out of Prohibition, and they create Schmidt's famous beer right here. So the natural brew. No sugar, no glucose added. It's good for you because it's non-fattening. That was how they advertised it. You think about all beer is non-fattening. There's no fat in beer, is there? But theirs was better because they didn't add any extra sugar, add extra glucose. Most brewers don't do that unless it's, say, a milk stout or something. But that's how they marketed themselves. And in their peak, they did about 250,000 barrels of beer in a year. Or said another way, about 5 times larger than Zenda. So they made it to that next level. And so they were on that edge of Eastern market. And they made it all the way to 1951, and then they closed and they were bought out by someone else, which was E&B, which I'll talk about in a second. So eventually a lot of these breweries, they started getting larger, they'd make it to one level, and then someone else would buy them out. And that's kind of the story to eventually everything kind of cascades down to Stroh. So if you had a chart, you could have like about 16 breweries that came out of Prohibition in Detroit. Eventually it all came down to Stroh. Like this, I actually have a chart in the book that shows it to you that way. So Auto City, Zenda, Schmidt's. There were a couple other breweries named Schmidt's. And people get really confused by the name. I always have to look at my notes so I don't say it the wrong way. There was Schmidt Beer out of St. Paul, and there was Schmidt Brewing out of Philadelphia. Both of those were way more well-known than Schmidt's was out of Detroit. Eventually, Pabst Brewing Company bought the rights to all 3 of those names. And today, PBR brews Schmidt beer out of St. Paul. So if you ever go to St. Paul, you can see it on a can. It's got a fish on it. It's just your basic light lager. It's nothing real special. It's just a mass market brand that they regionally sell in the St. Paul market. So nothing ever came of this though after they merged in 1951. So let's talk about the guy in the middle, Detroit Brewing Company. Anyone ever been to Detroit Beer Co. in downtown Detroit, across from the Opera House? Yes? Okay, one person. Okay, very good. You win. She just won the hidden beer that I drank. No, I'm just kidding. See? No, I'm kidding. Okay, so Detroit Brewing Company, totally unrelated. So Detroit Brewing Company, the original namesake, they started as the Martz Brewery. They were started by the Martz family in the late 1800s. And then post-Prohibition, they merged with another brewery and they got themselves into Eastern Market, and they're off Orleans Street. I started getting my addresses wrong before. There's a huge red brick building, and today it's called Metro Cold Storage. You might have parked your car there once on one of those side streets as you were trying to go into the market. It's a real obvious building today, but coming out of Prohibition, they were brewing a lot of beer out of there. So scientifically brewed and properly aged was one of their slogans. That's kind of an obvious one. The other one is the one I put up here, and I love this one. This is my favorite one of all the slogans here. Brewed for family use. So let me paint a picture of this for you, okay? So we're just about to come up on Thanksgiving. So here's an ad in the local paper. So you open up your paper in the morning, and this ad's in there from Detroit Brewing Company. And it has the whole family at the dinner table. So aunts, uncles, dogs, cats, kids, nieces, nephews, everybody's there, right? And the man of the house, he's up there, he's carving the turkey with one hand, and the other hand, he's holding a Detroit Bohemian beer. And there's a little bubble that comes out of it, and it says, the great family beer. And in the distance, you can see his son, he's almost crying because he's so proud of his old man for drinking this great family beer at the dinner and carving the turkey, doing a good job of that, right? Can you imagine we're watching the Super Bowl and a Bud Light ad came on and they showed you that same scene and the son was proud of his dad for drinking Bud Light? What would happen, you think, today? It would be a problem. But it wasn't a problem then. It was more traditional to show beer in that light. So Detroit Brewing Company did that with Detroit Bohemian. Who else had a Bohemian beer?
National.
What's that?
National Bohemian?
Definitely.
Cadillac.
Oh, very good. Okay.
That's where I grew up.
Yes, that isn't even the one I was thinking of, but yeah, you're right, that is too. So a lot of breweries use Bohemian as a generic way to talk about a German-style beer, basically. Stroh was also the more famous one that I was kind of alluding to as I asked that, but that's a very good example, thank you.
This mentions 3.5% though.
What's that?
So that's near beer, isn't it?
So no, this is still considered a regular
It
beer
is,
because it's
okay.
in that alcohol level. It would have to be a lot less to be considered a near beer.
Okay.
I talk about it a little bit in the book. There were these like small beers. A near beer would be a non-alcoholic beer and it'd be 0.5% or less. But there's small beers and you see them more in Europe and it'd be like 2.5%. In England, or I'm sorry, in Germany, we might use the term Radler. Has anyone ever heard the term Radler? Everyone ever heard of a summer shandy?
Yes.
Okay, so Leinenkugel's brought the English version of that called a shandy, which is a half lager, half lemonade type of beer. In Germany, it's called a Radler, which means to ride. So bikers would ride town to town, and then they didn't want to have a real high alcohol beer, so they would take a half lager and half, a lot of times it'd be like a Sprite. And that would be a true 2.5% beer, and it would say it right on the can. And I've been to Germany and other countries in Europe a few times, and you'll see this by all the train stations. They'll actually put the alcohol level really obvious on there, and it would fall more in that camp then. This would be more of a traditional, although in today's craft beer world it would seem very low, then that was pretty normal. So that was Detroit Brewing Company, and in their peak, again, they did about the same as Schmidt's. They made it in that 250,000 barrel range, and then they eventually closed up shop. No one bought them, and eventually that became Metro Cold Storage in the 1970s, and that's what it's been ever since. So again, kind of an example of someone who didn't sell out at all during that time. So let's talk about the one in the far corner here. It looks like a super old ad. It says E&B. Does anyone remember E&B or Eckhart and Becker Brewing Company? I hate to profile and like look at certain people and say, you gotta know E&B, right?
So you say they look oldest in the
I
world?
never said that though. If you notice, I never said that
I know, I'm
in my
kidding.
tone.
I'm
Did
kidding,
I?
I'm kidding.
That's how you know I've done a bunch of these.
Yeah.
And I'll, like if I'm doing bike tours and I'll have like, there'll be like 15 people that are all like in their 20s, and then there'll be like this nice friendly couple and they're like in their 50s and 60s, and they know all the cool beer history stuff. So if I ask those questions, usually you can just nod your head and know what's going on. People in their 20s, they don't know what I'm talking about. E&B, what? So Eckhart and Becker Brewing Company started in 1883. So they were one of the definitely early wave of breweries. August Eckhart and Herman Becker, they purchased the Umer Brewery on Russell Street in Detroit. And then they renamed it the Michigan Brewery. And then in 1891, they merged again with another brewery called the Fulda and Boomer Brewery. So this is very common at this time. You're open a few years, you merge with someone else, you change the name again. When you look at the brewing licenses, you can see it. It'd be like brewing license 15, A, B, C, D, E. And you can track all the different names of the breweries over the years. That's how I found all of this information. It's all public record to find them that way. So they merged with the Fulda and Boomer Brewery, and that got them to Winder and Orleans Street, exactly 1 block over from where Detroit Brewing Company was. So imagine that. You're a couple blocks away from Schmidt Brewing, you got Detroit Brewing, and now you got E&B Brewing, all in this Eastern Market area. Zenda wasn't too far away from there. And then eventually we'll get to Stroh and Goebel. That wasn't too far either. All this stuff was grouped in the Eastern Market area. Why was that?
Raw materials.
Access to hotness.
Access to raw materials, access to infrastructure. What was right there? The train. The Grand Trunk Western Rail Line. So because the train was there, access to raw materials, so Detroit River train continues going down, Pontiac and beyond,
Excuse me.
you had access to things. So that's why, same with auto history, same with Beckett, same with a million other automobile plants, you follow those train lines up, right? That's why Beckett's in the Milwaukee Junction area. I realize this is an auto talk, but it lends to what I'm saying. So the Ecker and Becker Brewing Company, same thing. So eventually, after they merged with the Folda and Boomer Brewing Company, they switched the name over to the Ecker and Becker Brewing Company post-Prohibition. And then the sons of the founders get involved, very common as we came out of Prohibition. And their claim to fame was they brewed a beer was called a Steiny beer. What do you think of Steiny? What does a Steiny sound like?
Dark beer.
It's maybe, right? It's a shorter bottle. So that's it. Nothing fancy with the beer in it at all. It was just a shorter bottle. And at that time, all beer bottles look kind of the same. Boom. We'll make ours a little bit smaller. We'll call it a Steiny style. People will take them a while to figure that out. It just means there were less ounces in the beer. And guess what? They sold more because of that. It's an amazing sales tactic. So Steiny kind of put them on the map. And they said flavored with age. So if they were scientifically brewed and properly aged for family use with Detroit Brewing Company, E&B was flavored with age. All beer is flavored with age. That's why you ferment it, for it to flavor, for the alcohol, for all the magic to happen in it. So they started buying breweries. They bought Regal Brewing Company, which I have a label example of up here, in 1837. And then they bought the Schmidt Brewery that I mentioned before in 1952. And then E&B merged with Pfeiffer Brewing Company, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes here. And they became Associated Brewing Company. And then I'll kind of talk, when I talk about Pfeiffer, a little more to why they really did that. But when they did that in 1970, they ceased brewing on that site. Eventually, they created that into the E&B Warehouse Lofts, which is what it is today. And you can still see it today. There's a scaffolding that goes across the street. There's a stock seller sign that says E&B and some beautiful Pawlik tile on the outside. It's a really neat structure. And if you're ever over in the Eastern Market area, it's really easy to walk over from the main drag to kind of check it out on Orleans and Winder Street there. So that was them. Let's switch gears into Belgian breweries. How many people like Belgian beer? Yes, you win again, right? Wait, there's a slight hand, slight maybe? So Belgian. So a lot of people forget that we had a lot of Belgians in the area. They weren't as well known as the Germans were. So Tivoli Brewing Company. I'm showing you an Altus beer label. I'm going to get to that in a second. But Tivoli Brewing Company was off Mack Avenue, not even that far from here. Maybe 8-9 miles from here.
It was about the corner of Mack and Cadillac, because I lived on Cadillac 3 houses.
Yeah,
Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
that's the same, it grew.
Same
into-
neighborhood.
You did? Okay, awesome. See, I didn't want to profile again and say, you guys must know. I mean, I know where it is. I'm not saying I don't know where it is, but okay, thank you. So it started as Tivoli Brewing Company in 1897 by 3 gentlemen that were part of Detroit's Belgian community. And that was very unique at that time. And since Germans started the majority of breweries in Detroit, talking about Belgians, we don't really talk about that in our history here. So they started with a Tivoli beer, and then as we came out of Prohibition, they reopened again, and they started this other beer. It was called Altus. And it was a German beer. They're a Belgian brewery, but it was a German beer. And lo and behold, that's the beer that really put them on the map, Altus. So most people have heard of Altus Brewing Company, but not Tivoli Brewing Company. So I have a mix of label examples of both up here for that reason. That's why I wanted to show the Altus label up here, but show you the Tivoli Brewery. So as we came out of Prohibition, within 3 years, they were doing 600,000 barrels of beer. Wow. Crazy. So Tivoli was a major player, and Altus sold so well as a Belgian-inspired German lager, I don't know how we'd say it, that they changed the name of the company to be Altus Brewing Company. That's when it eventually became Altus, just post-Prohibition. Then the story gets real interesting. National Brewing Company, out of where? Baltimore, thank you. Purchased them in 1955. It became National Brewing Company. It became National Brewing Company of Michigan. I always feel like I say that wrong. And what did they do when they did that?
They got a new mascot, because somewhere I've got the guy with the one eye.
Very good.
It's in here, I saw it.
So the guy with the one eye is called Natty Bo, or National Bohemian, as you referred to before. So what they did was National Brewing of Detroit is formed as National comes in here out of Baltimore. They stopped making Altus.
So you went half blind from drinking so much?
Haven't we all? And they
So
said,
you don't see double, you have to close one eye.
There it is.
he's like the mascot of Baltimore now. But he wasn't really the mascot of Detroit. No one knew what he was. So what did they do? They stopped making Altus. They introduced National Bohemian to the market. This weird dude, we don't understand his thought process at all. And that was a huge failure. And they lost all kinds of market share, and eventually they had to bring back the Altus name. But in that process, they eventually closed that brewery because it became outdated. They eventually shifted production back to Baltimore, where they started making Altus with National Bohemian there, and then they brought Altus, they sold it back in this market only. So totally crazy when you think of the logistics involved to do it that way. And then National Brewing eventually merges with Carling. So
That's very good.
Carling, what's their beer?
Black Label.
Black Label, very good. And Carling Black Label, they owned another brewery in what little Bavaria of Michigan? Frankenmuth. So what they eventually do is now it's Carling National, and now you have National Bohemian, Altus, the Frankenmuth Brewery. All those beers eventually are getting produced in Frankenmuth. So they shift all that over there. So eventually Altus gets back there, all the way up to about 1991. Somewhere in that process, Carling National is purchased by, do you remember who? G. Heilemann. Okay, so lots of purchases here. All started with Tivoli Brewing Company, which eventually became Altus Brewing, eventually bought by National, eventually Carling National, eventually G. Heilemann, and then eventually Stroh. But G. Heilemann had that huge brewery in Frankenmuth, which today has been completely demolished, and it's now those more modern shops as you first come in on Main Street before you get to the two chicken places. All right, what is that called? It's no, well,
Yeah.
I know that. I mean, those
Yeah.
shops. I always forget the name of those shops right there. But they're the newer shops on the other side of the bridge. That's where the G. Heilemann Brewery was. And if you ever want to learn more about the Frankenmuth history, there is a great beer museum that's tied to the beer store there right off Main Street that you got to check out next time you're there. The Lager Mill is what it's called. It's usually where the carriages are located. If you ever did the carriage rides in Frankenmuth, the beer store is right over there. They got a little museum attached to it that has a really good overview of this stuff that I totally copied so that I get the facts right for this here. So okay, so that was kind of the end of Tivoli. How about Pfeiffer, which I made mention to before? Anyone ever seen this building in person? This is my picture of this building. So obviously this was in the winter. This still stands there. That's obviously their can. Well, that's my can in this case because I have that can. That's Johnny Pfeiffer on there. So let's talk about Pfeiffer now. So Pfeiffer Brewing Company started in 1892 by Conrad Pfeiffer. So he's the namesake of the brewery. And after Prohibition, they incorporated as Pfeiffer Brewing Company with no original founding family members involved in it anymore. So as we came out of Prohibition, no one by the name of Pfeiffer was really related to the brewery, but they kept the name because it was a good name going into Prohibition. They decided that'd be a good name to bring back to life post-Prohibition. And they started building this amazing structure, which this barely shows you that on here. And if you go by this area, it's definitely an industrial area in the Mac and Mount Elliott sort of area on the lower east side of Detroit. And but they were a major player in brewing. So in 1934, they started producing again, and they ranked third in production behind Stroh and Schmidt at that point. So the beer market looked a little different at this point. Other players, Goebel hadn't really gotten going at this time. And then in the 1940s, they had finished the rest of the structure, and they were doing 400,000 barrels of beer a year at that time. So let's say that another way. Bell's last year, the largest brewery in Michigan, did about 450,000 barrels of beer, and they're 30 years old. So coming out of Prohibition, so new life for Pfeiffer, within 6-7 years, they're already kind of maxing out what they're doing right there. During the 1950s, Pfeiffer Brewing Company was considered the best-selling brand in all of Michigan. And they had another brewery on the west side of the state in Muskegon, which was real common for a lot of these breweries. They would start in Detroit, they might hook up with another brewery on the west side of the state, and that's how they were getting beer clear across there. So then, there was a brewery strike in 1958 that affected all the Detroit breweries. And that gave opportunity to who to come into our market? You got it. Bud and Miller, spot on. So Bud and Miller, because of that strike, came into our market. And what did they do? They sold their stuff cheaper. So they made it really, really hard for all the breweries as they came out of this workers' strike. I don't want to blame it on strikes, but definitely that disrupted the beer industry in 1958. It opened up a door. And what that did was all these breweries quickly realized that they needed to buy each other and get a lot of scale if they wanted to compete with Anheuser-Busch and Miller. So that's what Stroh did, Goebel did, Pfeiffer did, E&B did. So essentially E&B and Pfeiffer merge, it becomes Associated Brewing, and they start buying breweries in Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana so that they can regionalize. And that's what Pfeiffer did. So in their peak, they did a couple million barrels of beer in a year, and eventually they sold out into the G. Heilemann world. So G. Heilemann bought a lot of these breweries. And they're a whole different story. And if I was doing this talk in Milwaukee, most of my talk would be around Pabst, Miller, and all the G. Heilemann stuff that happened. Old Style, if you ever went to a Cubs game and drank Old Style, that was a G. Heilemann brand. But there were 30 plus brands under G. Heilemann, a whole bunch of which were tied to Detroit. So people kind of forget that about Pfeiffer. So that Johnny Pfeiffer guy there, guess who designed that? It wasn't me, just you're wondering, like, did he do that, really? No. So that's Johnny Pfeiffer, that was their mascot. Walt Disney.
Really?
So a side business for the Walt Disney Studios was that they would design lots of caricatures for other companies, for brands. And they created Johnny Pfeiffer, the very well-known brand. So there's these awesome clay, there's a lot of different, I'm losing my train of thought, sorry. There were a lot of different caricatures and statues made of Johnny Pfeiffer over the years. They're super collectible now. Does anyone have one? Because I'd buy it off you. I've definitely been looking for a good one that's not cracked. So, okay, like I said, Pfeiffer made it all the way up to 1972, and then when they sold out to G. Heilemann, eventually they stopped making that Pfeiffer brand. So let's shift gears to this.
Did Disney do Brewster?
Oh, did they do the, wait, that guy?
That guy.
No, they didn't.
They did.
I did look that up to see, actually, it was not Walt Disney though. It was some unknown person that
Design for
did that.
okay.
Yeah, definitely. I'm surprised I haven't been asked that before. It seems such an obvious question now.
Yeah.
But you know the Rooster. So I'll come back to him though in a second, I promise. Is anyone familiar with Kobitz beer? No?
Only because you're poker.
If you notice over here, you might not have seen it. I have a display of about 20 of them. So I got that out of a pawn shop, someone who clearly collected those labels. They're highly collectible. Why do you think these labels are so collectible?
World War II.
You
Yeah.
got it. It's war insignias. Military collectors buy them. And they don't want to sell them. So, in fact, none of these made it into my book before I had to send it to print. And I was trying. I just wasn't willing to pay the price that they were trying to sell someone from. Eventually, I found someone and bought a whole lot of them out of them. You know, for the post project, of course. That's what I had to tell the wife. Anyway, okay. Kobitz-Meckler Brewing Company. So Kobitz-Meckler. So, they started in 1884. And both of these gentlemen worked for Stroh. They learned the brewing trade, and eventually they broke out on their own, and they started the Kobitz-Meckler Brewing Company, like I said, in the late 1800s. Their original brewery was a 60,000 barrel brewery on Gratiot Avenue, down the road from Goebel and Stroh. And it looked like a castle. And how many people are familiar with Fago? Right by their property.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen it before? There's some good pictures.
I remember seeing pictures of it, yeah, there was
Yeah,
very big.
like if you're at an art fair and they have great historic pictures and they'll show old buildings, usually one of them is that old structure. I don't have a picture of it up here because I like the labels better. So that was their original brewery. And then post-Prohibition, they built a very modern brewery, basically at Detroit River and Dubois Street. So if you know where Atwater Street is, okay, and Dubois comes out, has anyone ever been to Shane Park? Well, Shane Park used to be a brewery. That was the Kobitz-Meckler Brewing Company post-Prohibition. So they were so confident you could figure out where that was, they didn't have any numbers on their address. It's one of those funny things. It would say, Kobitz-Meckler Brewing Company, Dubois and the river. You just had to know that, right? I'm sure I don't...
You're obviously not from Detroit,
No.
because it's Du Bois.
I
Du Bois, yeah.
But I say Dubois, because I like to sound French. But thank you. No, I'm from...
He's actually pronouncing it correctly, we pronounce it wrong, that's right, yeah.
But if you rode the bus,
Yeah, yeah.
there was a stop on Gratiot, and it was Du Bois and Gratiot.
Oh my God, oh, okay. I didn't know that. That's funny.
I mean, that was what they announced.
I remember the first time I did my brewery history bike tour, and I said Goebel, and someone said, "Do you mean Jobel?" And I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, and it was like that was how people pronounce Goebel, and I'm like, you mean the German brewery Goebel? You know, with a French pronunciation? Yeah. So same concept.
That's funny.
So Kobitz-Meckler Brewing Company builds this large brew house, and then during the war effort, obviously they started brewing this Kobitz Victory beer. And when troops came back, they loved that beer. That was their beer. Totally makes sense, right? We send it over for the war effort, they come back. They had a total of 100 different labels like this. And of each of those, they had very limited runs of them. That's why they're so collectible. They're very hard to come across. So I'm up to, I think I have 22 now. I don't have them all on display right here, but I have about 22. I've been told I am not allowed to get all 100, was what was told to me, and I do what I'm told. So
It's easier to ask forgiveness than permission.
I'm already pretty deep into
Was
the
all
labels.
beer originally in bottles? They weren't canned?
Correct.
It was all bottles?
Cans came really more kind of post-World War II.
Okay.
Very good question. Yeah. And now look at where cans are now with craft beer. It's kind of come all the way back again, hasn't it? Now all these craft breweries are doing almost everything in cans. Definitely all the new ones are. So Kobitz-Meckler Brewing Company made it all the way to 1948, and then they were bought by Jobel Global Brewing Company in 1948, and then that became another post of a global brewery. So the other global brewery was on Gratiot across the street from Stroh Brewery. I'll talk about that in a second. But they continued to brew beer out of there all the way to 1964, and then that's when Goebel was bought by Stroh, and then Stroh closed the brewery that Kobitz-Meckler started post-Prohibition. And then in the 1980s, Mr. Coleman Young, that was one of his big projects, he created Shane Park, and that's what it's been ever since. And that became the end of the Kobitz-Meckler Brewing Company story. So how am I doing on time? Am I all right?
Oh, yeah.
Keep going? Keep it going? Okay. So let's get to Jobel then. I've been dancing around it too much here. All right. Okay. So Global Brewing Company. So I got a couple different pictures here. I know they're a little small. I apologize because I was trying to see how many things I could put on one screen here. That would be kind of the older picture, their older brewery. That would be the one that you could still see except for the smokestack part of that. Mostly this part of it today. So today, if you go across the street from where Cranes Communications is on Gratiot, you go across the street, that part of the building's there. Like I said, not the smokestack, it's very different, kind of to the left of that. So
Stroh's Ice Cream and where you would go on the Stroh's tours was next to this building, across Gratiot.
Was actually in that building.
It was, okay.
Yeah,
That's what
sorry.
I meant.
I should have said it like
I
that.
apologize.
That's all right. There's a lot to now explain about
Yeah.
that building because it now has a new life as part of Detroit City Distillery. And now they're doing tours in there. And that's just in the last less than a year. So I never used to be able to say that before. So okay, let's start a little bit with their history. So Colonel August Goebel, he was in the Civil War. That's how old he was. And he started Goebel Brewing Company in 1873. It was originally called A. Goebel and Company Brewery. That's a lot to say. So post-Prohibition, they were a little slow to start up their brewery right there across the street from Stroh. They didn't start till 1934. If you remember, I made mention before and I said Pfeiffer was a major player with Stroh and Schmidt, but I didn't say Goebel in that in the early 1930s because they were a little slow to get going. But they did eventually get going, but they had bigger challenges. They had an image problem. Why do you think they had an image problem? Because they're German.
The seal, the gold label in the
So
middle.
look at that,
Yes.
look at that right there.
Yeah, it looks like a
right?
Nazi
So when I'm
symbol.
doing these live in a brewery, I have to like describe it. Where here I can point to it. So what they did was they said, oh, okay, so a Nazi eagle on a beer label as a sales guy is probably not a good thing to have to sell in America. Maybe not. So they rebranded themselves and they created essentially this. Right? Doesn't that look American? Does that scream anything German anymore? No, not really. And then eventually they came out with this guy, the Brewster Rooster, the real irritating cackle. They advertised on all the sports, for every Detroit sports team. They were the player for that. That's why they did. They wanted you to forget that part of their heritage at that point. And it was a good play that they did there. So they were considered a value brand. And how much do you think in the late 1970s a case of 12-ounce bottles of Goebel went for? $4.44, but if you returned all the bottles, it was $3.44. So they were the value brand for sure in those times. So Goebel beer. And that's why Stroh eventually bought them or took them out, because they realized they could continue to sell that with little to no advertising, but because it was such a great price. So when I get folks that are maybe slightly younger, they always say, that was the beer I drank in college. I must have heard that 1,000 times now. And then they would always say, oh my God, I had so many cases of Goebel beer in college, because that was the cheap beer. So me, it was Natural Light in college, unfortunately. So Natty Light, right? Oh gosh, my stomach just churns even thinking about it. So Goebel Brewing made it all the way up to 1964, and that's when Stroh came in and bought them. And like I said, they kept them on as a value-based brand. Literally with no advertising, was able to sell 250,000 barrels of beer a year. Can you imagine that? How'd you like that business? I don't have to spend any money on advertising, and I could sell 250,000 barrels of beer a year. Sounds pretty good to me. So they kept doing that. Eventually they took that property and it did turn into the Stroh's ice cream plant. There's still a Stroh's ice cream sign on the side there today. I'll get to the Stroh story kind of in a second here. So from the Cypress Cask of Goebel was their original slogan. And then when the Brewster Rooster guy came out, kind of post-World War II, they shifted gears to be too good to miss. If it's Goebel, it's good, yes.
What is that 22?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that. Right as I looked at that and I thought, what does a 22 mean? I don't know, actually.
Bobby Lane's number.
What's that?
Bobby Lane's number.
Oh, very good.
Way to go, Ken.
I don't know if
Okay.
That's why.
That's awesome. I'm totally remember that.
Bobby Lane. Lions
Lions quarterback.
If you learn anything about doing live talks is that you usually get asked a couple things you don't totally know, but you try to listen to if someone knows the answer so that you can then say it next time and look super smart.
The jersey the Rooster's wearing, that is in the Lions color, and if it's a color ad?
Yeah, no, I never found a color
Yeah.
ad though, so it was always a black and white ad.
Yeah.
You know what, if that would have been a color ad, then I would have just figured that out probably
Yeah.
pretty quick, huh?
Football.
Yeah,
Like
right.
catching the football.
Yeah.
that's
It
funny.
makes super sense now.
Yeah.
So Goebel, so let's go back to sports. So they were attributed to the Detroit Tigers, Lions, even the Red Wings at one point for Goebel beer. So in 1958, I said there was a brewer's strike, and that brought in kind of Anheuser-Busch and Miller into the market, so Bud and Miller. That also put these guys in a cash poor position, which means they had to give up their sponsorship of telecast for the Detroit Tigers. Who was the announcer at that time? His name was Van Patrick. So then Stroh picked it up, and they didn't want the same announcer. Who did they bring to Detroit? Ernie Harwell. So you can thank beer for Ernie Harwell coming to Detroit. So Goebel, Stroh. So Goebel didn't have money for it anymore. Stroh wanted it, but they didn't want the same guy that was associated with Goebel. Totally makes sense. That opened up the door. He suggested Ernie Harwell come here. and the rest is history. Kind of a neat story tied to that I found as I was doing some research on this for Global Beer. So like I said, they made it to 1964 and then Stroh got involved. So let's go through some Stroh history. They're kind of the big dog in the room here. They probably have the most interesting of the histories. So there's two different years when we talk about Strohs. If you look at old ads, you'll see a heritage of brewing since 1775, and then you'll see established in 1850. Very common for immigrant breweries like this. So 1775 is alluding to the fact that the Stroh family lived in Kern, Germany, and they had a family inn that also brewed beer. And the parents brewed beer, and they had 3 sons. And that inn could only support one family, so it got passed down to the oldest son. The other 2 sons eventually leave Germany and come to America, including Bernard Stroh, who eventually, he came here in 1847, and then in 1850, he started the Lion Brewing Company. So that's him up there. I don't have the picture of Lion Brewing Company on here. That's a really old Stroh picture there.
That's the workers at lunch, right?
That is the workers at lunch.
Yeah.
They look so happy, don't they?
Oh, yeah.
So in 1850, he starts the Lion Brewing Company in what we consider Greektown today. But what was Greektown before it was Greektown? It was more like Germantown. And that's where a lot of the Germans lived at that time. And there were a lot of different German breweries that were located in and around the Greektown area. So before the casinos, before the restaurants, before all that stuff, right, you had Stroh. And that's where they were. And eventually they moved over to where Cranes Communications is today. I'm sure most of you can remember the big iconic Stroh sign as we came in. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit too much though, sorry. So in 1875, like I said, in 1902, they eventually changed the name to the Stroh Brewery Company. And that's what it stayed ever since. Except during Prohibition from 1918 to 1933, where it was the Stroh Products Company. So during Prohibition, what did they do? What did they start making? Ice cream. That's right. But they were so worried that they were going to tarnish the Stroh brand during Prohibition that they didn't call it Stroh's Ice Cream during Prohibition. What's the coldest state? Alaska. It was Alaska brand ice cream during Prohibition. And as we came out of Prohibition, because it sold so well, they're like, wow, we want to slap our name on this now. We want to keep this part of the business going. That's exactly what they did, and they established the Stroh's ice cream brand. But that wasn't until 1933, 34 when they did that. Kind of funny. So when you see really old pictures, if you looked at the old Brewed in Detroit book, he's got the best archives. There's pictures of Alaska brand ice cream in there. That's where I pulled that information from. So the Stroh's ice cream business continued to flourish as we came out of Prohibition. And then what famous dairy company did they merge with in the 1980s? Or I'm sorry, did they spin off the Stroh's ice cream to in the 1980s? Starts with an M. Melody Farms. So Melody Farms in the 1980s bought the Stroh's ice cream part. And then in that plant where Global Brewing was, they shifted all the Stroh's ice cream production over there. And it's actually pretty interesting. So when Detroit City Distillery earlier this year came into that same property, there's a billboard over there. And back when they first announced that merger, it said, together, 2 family traditions together again, or something like that. And it had Melody Farms and Stroh's Ice Cream right next to it on this billboard. As they were cleaning up the billboard, they extracted that. You can see that there right now. They must have taken who knows how many years worth of old billboard paper off of there. And you can now see that exposed. They did that in the last couple months there. So Melody Farms gets it in the 1980s, and then in 2003, the National Dairy Company comes in here, Dean Foods, and they buy Melody Farms. And then they continue to produce ice cream out of that plant till 2007. If you remember in 2003 when they bought them, they said, we're never going to close that plant. We'll continue to make Stroh's ice cream here forever. Well, that lasted 4 years. And then they closed that plant in 2007. And it was just recently that Detroit City Distillery came into that property there. So kind of a neat story for the ice cream part of it, except that the ice cream's just not made here anymore. It's made in Illinois. I know. So let's get back to the beer part though. Let's get back to the positive part of this here. So Stroh's beer. So we come out of Prohibition. Different Stroh family members are taking over the company at that time. And they're going through lots and lots of growth as we're coming out of here. As we get into 1964 and they acquired Global, that's when they started buying lots of other breweries. And as we got into the 1970s, they bought Schaefer Brewing Company and they bought Schlitz Brewing Company. And when they bought those two breweries, that propelled them to the third largest brewery in the United States behind Anheuser-Busch and Miller. A lot of people don't give Stroh Brewery Company credit that they became the third largest player. And in the 1980s, Stroh Brewery did 24 million barrels of beer in a year.
They also went heavily into debt, though,
Yes. Which eventually
caught up with them. Yeah.
which eventually caught up to them. But in the 1980s, before we get to the really bad debt
Sorry,
part,
yeah.
before we get to the really bad debt part, what started happening on the West Coast in the 1980s that eventually cascaded over here in the beer world?
Light beer?
You got it, craft beer. Yeah, light beer happened in the 1970s. And I sort of skipped over that because I realized I've been talking a little long. So in the 1980s, microbrew beer is what we called it then. We weren't smart enough to call it craft beer at that part. Now, if you're hip with the kiddies, you say craft beer. If you're a little older like me, you say microbrew beer. So microbrew beer started in the 80s. Stroh, as they started acquiring all these breweries, had lots of excess capacity. So what did they do? They started contract brewing for all these smaller players, like the Boston Beer Company, which is Sam Adams, Sierra Nevada, Pete's Wicked Ale, if you can remember that one from the 1990s. That one's not around any longer. And in the 1980s, 25% of Stroh's business was actually contract brewing craft beers. Kind of wild. And then they had some of their own labels that came out. So we still had Stroh Light, we had Signature, we had those great iconic labels, but they had lots of other smaller brands that they were trying to sell as pseudo craft brands at that time. Very similar to what Anheuser-Busch and Miller do today. So as we got into the 1990s, in 1996, Stroh acquired G. Heilman. And I mentioned G. Heilman out of Wisconsin before. I said they were a super large brewery. And who had they acquired? Who had G. Heilman of the Detroit breweries already acquired? Well, Pfeiffer, E&B, Schmidt, Regal, Altus. All that stuff was already under G. Heilman. And then G. Heilman went through 2 rounds of bankruptcy. And then eventually Stroh came in and they were able to buy him in 1996, which highly leveraged the Stroh Brewery Company to the level that they actually tried to merge with Coors about a year later. And Coors came out here, and then what did Coors eventually do? Well, they looked at the books, and they saw how leveraged they were, and they walked away from the deal. And unfortunately, that was kind of the last straw. And in 1999, like you alluded to in the intro, they sold the company, and they kind of split it into 2. And Pabst Brewing Company got Stroh and Stroh Light and most of the G. Heilman labels, which was 30+ labels. And then a bunch of the malt liquor brands went to Miller. So any malt liquor brand you could ever mention is basically owned by Miller today. But at one point, Stroh was really manufacturing that. Colt 45, Mickey's, you name it. Before 1999, Stroh was probably in that part of the market. And then that was really why Miller bought that part of it. And then PBR, which was really just someone who owned a bunch of brands. They didn't own breweries at that point in 1999. They contracted Stroh back to Miller. So if you look at a Stroh and Stroh Light can today, you can see how it says Milwaukee, Wisconsin on it. And that's because Miller is really contract brewing it for PBR. Except for what you alluded to in the intro, last year, when Brew Detroit, the contract brewery in Corktown, which does half of Atwater's beers, the Kid Rock beer, and a lot of others, they contract brew with PBR, the Stroh's Bohemian Pilsner, which is this logo right down here.
Does it taste like, I haven't had it.
You've never had it? Has anyone had it in here?
The new
Yes?
Strohs taste like the old Strohs?
Not at all. You didn't?
That's what I thought, yeah.
It's a good beer,
Yeah.
but it's brewed for more of a craft beer crowd because it has a bit more of a hop presence on the back end of it. It is a really good drinkable beer. But if you look at how they price it in the marketplace, it's got these really cool bottles, like a slightly shorter bottle. They price, say, $6.99 for a 6-pack. It's not priced like a Dirty 30 cans of Strohs or something like that you might refer to it as. Yes?
Isn't it advertised as being the original strength, not watered down?
Which, the Bohemian Pilsner?
Yeah, what's brewed in
Corktown?
Corktown.
Definitely. So the recipe goes way, way back to the early 1900s, pre-Prohibition. That's definitely what you're referring to. And what they couldn't emulate was the fact that what was Stroh's known for originally? Being America's only fire brewed beer. So a lot of people were hopeful when this came out. Said, "Ooh, look, it's a darker barrel. It looks more full bodied. Maybe that's what they're doing." Modern breweries don't brew that way anymore. That's not common. You wouldn't come across that. It's not safe. So it was in about the 1950s when Stroh really got out of using that same types of terminology. But a lot of people kind of hoped for that when they did that. That's not the case though, but it is a fuller body, fuller flavored beer, but it's not fire brewed anymore. But that was their tagline for many years, was America's only fire brewed beer. So that was
a friend, if I may.
Yeah.
About 2010, I had a friend that drank Stroh's, an older gentleman that lived in Beverly Hills, and there was a beer store at 12 and Southfield. I could still buy Stroh's for him. It was the only place I could find it for him. It seemed like on the west side if I was out by his house. Was that still the old fire brewed or not? By that time it was gone.
I'd be doubtful that that would have been.
So after they closed in '99 year, it wasn't fire brewed anymore.
It was well before that. So,
Okay.
So let me back up. So I realized I skipped around a little bit on my Stroh's history. So in 1985, they closed this brewery.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Okay. So after 1985, no Stroh was made in Michigan anymore.
Right.
But definitely about 20 plus years before that, they really got out of the fire brew process.
Okay.
I always forget the exact year. But eventually, as they scaled up, they couldn't scale up doing that because it wasn't safe. So most breweries didn't, but they adapted it from something they saw in Europe at that time. So was anyone there the day they imploded all of this? Yes? Do you remember when?
86, 80, I don't know. I had just gotten married. I got married in 85, so I thought it was a year or two after they.
You're right.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was
Yeah.
86. Yeah.
Or 87. I think
Was
it's
it?
87.
Okay.
Yeah. And then eventually that became Brewery Park and Trans Communications, and that's what it is all today. Kind of a fun story. But like I said, in their peak, 24 million barrels of beer, third largest brewery in the United States, and we need to give Detroit more credit for that brewery heritage. So I'll give a real fast talk on craft beer, and then any other questions I'm glad to take.
Workers at Strauss could drink beer, as much beer as they consume. While they were working.
I had a neighbor
As
who I cut
long
lawn
as
for
they
that
didn't
drank
get drunk.
constantly.
Right.
Well,
If they got drunk.
They had huge alcohol problems when they
Yeah.
closed down the brewery.
Oh, I've heard so many of these interesting stories now from doing these talks.
Same thing.
Yeah.
I think they all, I think all of them.
All those breweries did. Every once in a while, you see a report about a European brewery where they said how they banned drinking at lunch or banned drinking on shift. And nowadays, modern craft breweries don't typically allow that. And that's where the term shift beer comes from. If you ever hear that term shift beer, if you go to a brewery when they switch shifts on the brew teams, they'll all be sitting at the bar and be having their shift beer because they weren't allowed to drink as they were brewing. But that was normal for a long, even my buddy in early 2000 worked for Miller in Milwaukee, and he was allowed to drink beer at lunch. And he was a contractor. He was like an IT guy. And he was like,
Very good friend of mine
Chip change.
became John Stroh's personal assistant. They would hire a guy out of college to be his personal assistant and prepare his breakfast and lunch for him. And they had a beautiful executive dining room. Now you got me over there periodically, and they had a view of the brewery from this room where John Stroh would come in and have his breakfast and his lunch. It was hand prepared by my best friend of mine.
"So you're making me hungry."
And it was always eggs, I can't remember, it was eggs over easy or something. But anyway, you had a view of the brewery floor from this elaborate room. And you could watch these guys, they walk over to the coolers and
Grab a beer.
They grab a beer.
So
and they
amazing.
work at 10 in the morning.
Now, if you worked for me on my tour company, you were allowed to drink on the job. So,
And ride a bike too.
so no. So I'm surprised no one asked me that sooner. So the bike tours are different. So the bike tours are, you learn about history, you get rewarded a beer at the end. So you don't drink and bike because that's not safe.
Yeah.
And you get a ticket for that, and I never want to have anyone to get hurt on one of my tours. But if you're on a bus tour or walking tour, you're drinking at all the stops.
But you stop so that when they get in the car at the end, they've been not drinking for 2 hours?
2 hours, of course. You know what's,
Moving on, anyway.
We use Uber.
actually, you know what's common now? It's all Uber and Lyft.
Okay.
So I just did a tour last Saturday. I had about 35 people, and I took them out to the Rochester Mills Production Brewery, which is just the other side of the palace, and the 2 new breweries in Pontiac. I would say that 75% of people showed up Uber and Lyft. So they get a ride to where I picked up in Royal Oak, they jump on the bus, they go on the tours, they have fun, and then they Uber and Lyft home at the end. In the last couple of years, it's totally shifted. I really don't worry about it as
That's
much.
good.
But the reason I do a lot of tours, say out of Royal Oak, besides the fact that I live in Berkeley, is that there's a parking garage there and there's a bunch of restaurants they can walk to afterward to sober up. And I'm not looking for a super drunk kind of clientele. I kind of price my tours to be more mid-market. And most of my clientele is 35 to 55 is what I found. And I'm not looking for 21-year-olds that want to slam beer. I'm really looking for people who want to enjoy beer. So I actually don't have a lot of problems with that. The craft beer drinker, right, as I kind of define it there, and the market in Michigan is pretty amazing for beer tourism now. And a lot of people come to the state for beer tourism. We've been considered 6th in the nation for a number of breweries in Michigan, over 300. And I continue every year to bring people to newer stuff. It's amazing. Just in this market, we've had a couple dozen new breweries open up in the last couple of years here, let alone the rest of the state where it's just
It's
exploded.
a similar company to your tour company in Grand Rapids too. They've got signs say Beer City on the billboards on your way there.
So for a little while, I was doing tours out of Grand Rapids and out of Detroit. I found that this model works better if you're only in one market. And that's why I've stayed here. Plus I'm from here. And I found that you get better relationships if you do it that way. So there's now people doing something somewhat similar to what I do in pretty much every market across the US. When I started in 2009, that was not the case. There was maybe 1 or 2 on the West Coast that did it, and I had to sort of create it. And think of how the tourism scene in Detroit has changed in just the last couple of years. Now people want to come here. When I started, I would spend the first couple of seasons of bike tours, I spent more time explaining to people that it was all right to ride a bike in the city. Now I don't have to talk about that anymore. Now they're just excited as they're out biking and not have to worry about it. They thought people were running around with machine guns or something. And yes,
What about the cider industry that is tied in with beer for people that are gluten intolerant?
it's like my wife's in the audience. So my wife doesn't drink beer. Thank you for the question. So I know a lot about hard cider. So because we have lots of apple orchards in Michigan, we have a great wine industry here. So a small winemaker's license falls under for wine, cider, and mead. Those parts of the alcohol spectrum. Spirits is a different license, and beer is a different license, right? So they have different rules. We have a great market now for hard cider. We have some of the best hard cider now in the United States. Occasionally I incorporate that into what I do. I'm a big fan of Vanderbilt on the west side of the state. They're out of the Spring Lake area.
What's the one in Romeo?
There's one in Armada that's Blake's. That's the one that's maybe more well known. I kind of grew up going there to cut down Christmas trees, and now they're making hard cider.
Yeah.
They've invested
Angry something angry.
Angry Orchard.
Yeah.
Do you know who owns Angry Orchard? Sam Adams. So what's happened is with the growth of hard cider, 40 to 50% of the business at the Boston Beer Company, which owns Sam Adams, is really other non-beer related things, such as hard cider. They make twisted tea. They have that.
But it has alcohol in it.
It does. So it's interesting. If you were in Europe and you said hard cider, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They just call it cider. Here we say cider is what the kids drink, no alcohol, and hard cider is with alcohol. That's the difference. So most hard ciders are in that, say, like 6%, some's even 8, 9%. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening right now in Michigan with hard cider and with craft spirits. They're kind of where we were in the 1990s when we first started beer here. So in 1992, we changed the law here, and it was a lawyer for Traffic Jam and Snug. How many people have been to Traffic Jam and Snug Restaurant Brewery? Yep. First brew pub in Michigan. And in 1992, their lawyer, Tom Burns, with Larry Bell, who started Bell's Brewery, they helped change the law in the state to open up the floodgates for brew pubs. So here's a simple way to look at it, right? All breweries are either breweries or microbreweries, depending on the barrels you do in a year, or a brew pub. The big difference is if you're a microbrewery or brewery, you can sell to a distributor that sells to a store. If you're a brew pub, you're really a restaurant that makes beer and you sell all your stuff on site. That's the easiest way to say it. You can read the definitions more, but I don't want you to get too caught up in that. So Traffic Jam and Snug was the first brew pub in Michigan. The second one was called Grand Rapids Brewing Company. The second one to be created. There was an original one kind of pre and post Prohibition, and then there was one that opened up in 1992 right after Traffic Jam.
I was smiling because Motor City Brewing Company, of course, is in the back of Traffic Jam's parking lot, and they've been arguing forever about the use of the parking lot and everything, yeah.
So I'm like Switzerland in that conversation. So I get asked this stuff a lot.
Yeah.
So 60% of my bike tours I run out of Traffic Jam and Snug's parking lot. So I'm friends with both of them. I actually keep 4 of my rental bikes in the warehouse of Motor City Brewing Works, but then they eat and drink at the end at Traffic Jam. And then they go across the street and get a couple samples at Motor City. And they thought it was amazing that people, when I said that, I'm like, how'd you get both of them to work together? I'm like, because I support both of them. Like, who cares? I don't care about that conversation. In the end, they're both great people to work with. So Tom Burns went directly across the street from Traffic Jam in 1992, and he started Detroit Mackinac Brewing Company, which eventually became Motor City Brewing Works. He unfortunately died in 1994, and then his head brewer, John Lenardis, he started it as Motor City Brewing Works in 1995, and that's what it's been ever since. So most people never heard of the Detroit Mackinac Brewing Company, but that's really the one who helped change the law in the state. And then what they would do for many years, and why this riff eventually started, was they would brew beer at Motor City Brewing Works. They would take it across the street to ferment at Traffic Jam and Snug. And then eventually Motor City Brewing Works opened up a tap room, and eventually they opened up a kitchen. And then that really competed.
Now you
with
got
it.
a restaurant now.
And now you got lawsuits and all this other garbage that came out. And today most people that are younger wouldn't know anything about that. You'd have to have kind of been around to live through some of that.
Well, having gone to Wayne State, I can remember Traffic Jam when there was just, the urinal on the front with no sign,
Yeah.
with the flowers planted in it.
So anyone know what
you
year-
knew you were going there?
Anyone know what year Traffic Jam and Snug opened up?
73, no, 70.
Close, 1965.
Oh, real, way back, okay.
Yeah,
Long
and
before me.
it was basically that someone said there would be a Traffic Jam if you ever opened up a restaurant right there. Traffic Jam and Snug. Anyone know what a Snug is? It's like a private drinking room next to a restaurant. So it's usually a little higher and people can't look in. So now they say the bar side is really the Snug, but whatever. It's a fancy name. And they're a restaurant, a brewery, a bakery, and a dairy. So, and originally their brewer was the one making cheese there. And recently he's spun off and he's created a place called Riley Creamery. And he's making artisanal ice creams and cheeses. And I think he's going to get something in the New Center area very soon. He's going to have a retail shop. But he lives not too far from here. He's not in Grosse Pointe, but he's pretty close to here. So, very nice guy. So, a little bit about Traffic Jam and Snug. And that was about all I had. Lots of good questions, though.
You told us about the little beers. You never mentioned a GIQ. Who's responsible for a GIQ?
Thanks for coming. I'm sorry for
A GIQ,
Giant Imperial.
Giant Imperial Quart.
I don't
It
know.
was introduced here in Detroit. And I
They were
never
about
sure
eight
what
You need to talk to him on the way out.
I do. I want to know more. I want to learn more about that.
Stephen, can you pass those out?
I'm sorry.
Can you pass those out?
Oh, sure. I think I have enough koozies for everybody here. Inside these koozies has my card and a sticker. You can learn more about what I'm doing.
When you go on these tours, what does it cost to go on these?
So what does it cost to go on the tours? The walking tours, which I do in Royal Oak and Midtown area, are $42.50 a person, include lunch and beer samples at all 3 locations.
The bus?
The bus tours vary, start at $55 a person, include kind of the same stuff, but you're on a bus.
Okay.
The bike tours are $35 a person. They include the history of the bike ride, a guide, and lunch and multiple beers.
You have to supply your own bike.
It's bring your own bike. I have a couple rentals. We call it BYOB, bring your own bike. But now that we have Mogo rentals in the city, everyone get one? There's lots of great
How do
options.
you contact you for that?
That's funny, you asked the question and the answer's in your hand. That was perfect. It's right on the website. So if you go to my website or if you go to Facebook or Instagram, yeah, everything's on there. We do public and private events. We do lots of great corporate events. We do lots of fun things. I have lots of different history formats, but beer history obviously is kind of my passion. The bike tours have 8 or 9 different routes. I'm gonna have a couple different ones that I'm researching right now for next year. I do a couple out of Atwater Brewery. I'll have one out of Atwater in the park next year that'll be about auto history, and then you get like a burger and a beer at the end kind of thing. So I'm always kind of changing up. Did I? No, I did not. No, that was someone else. I wish I could. I'd love to.
I think your GIQ was the size of the bottle.
Yes.
It was the size of the bottle. Okay.
It was
I've never.
a giant, GIQ is giant imperial pour.
The guys used to buy them coming home from us.
I've heard of Imperial Port before.
Like
I guess I
Canadian.
never heard it said as giant Imperial Port.
Yeah.
I'm sure I have a
It
beer
was big.
label of one of those.
You'll have to do some research.
Yeah.
Dang, that's like
I don't know who introduced it, but it was pretty much
I think
introduced in this
Global.
area. I think Pfeiffer, Global,
I think it was
Global or Stroh. One
Or
of those.
Pfeiffer. Why does Pfeiffer make it sound like they had something
Well, it
like
was
that?
the local
It was a local
beer.
beer in the beginning.
Yeah, yeah.
the working guys.
How interesting. Okay.
I have a question. You know, every little neighborhood used to have a neighborhood bar. I mean, back way before. Forget what they happened to draw. And they all seem to have different glasses. If you got a draft, you got a Schuper or a Shell.
Or fish
Yeah, I mean, the Boomba. I mean, who made those? Did the breweries give those out?
Yep. So in Michigan, that's outlawed. So you can't do that in Michigan. But in other states you can. So logoed glassware.
I didn't know. I can't remember. I mean, I was too young to
Yeah,
drink.
but we have Stroh's glasses.
I know, they sell them.
You know,
That's the difference. Or the brewery gave them out or whatever, they were promoting things there. But if you went to a bar, they're not allowed to give those to the bar to serve to you that way. Where if you were in Chicago, you could go to a bar and all the glasses at that bar could say Bud Light on them. You couldn't go to a bar here and have it that way, not legally.
they couldn't.
And why do you think they do that in Michigan? Because they don't want to have too much power. Yeah, so there's lots of laws around, you know, what you call pay to play, right? So they don't want in these bars for that bar getting all these kickbacks, and then they only supply that brewery's beers. They don't want that. So if you were a brew pub and it was all your own product, that's different. You could do that. Although they still don't do that because people steal them. But that's a different conversation. But there was a time when those breweries were very common. A lot of that was pre-prohibition when that happened. Post-prohibition is a little different. But you could be in other states and it would not be that way. They'd have all kinds of freebies. When I lived in Chicago for 10 years, I got all kinds of free glassware, like all the time. But I came back to Michigan and I was just like, whoa, I don't want to pay for all of that. No way. So I started a beer tour company so that breweries would give me free stuff. So including the free beer I got during my podcast.
There used to be a law in Michigan that the brewing companies, beer companies couldn't give you, in fact, probably liquor companies as well, could not give you a lighted sign. If you owned a bar, if you wanted a lighted sign, you had to buy it.
Yep.
Oh.
So that's the same laws. It's all the same thing. There's always lots of legislation going on in Lansing where they're trying to change some of that.
You probably bought the lighted sign and then gave you several cases of beer to go with it.
Like I do 2 charity bike events tied in with a beer bar, a nonprofit, and another brewery. So New Belgian Brewing, they came into the market, they're into biking, and so they give away promo bikes. Okay, there's a New Belgian Brewing bike they give away. They're now made by Detroit Bikes in Detroit, which is very cool. So for the last 2 years, or for the last 5 years, I've been doing these charity bike events at a Clubhouse BFD in Rochester Hills, which is a really great beer bar. But for me to do that, I'm a LLC, I'm a for-profit company. I can't do that legally. So I work with a nonprofit. The nonprofit gets a percentage of the ticket proceeds. They pull the licensing to do that. And New Belgium donates the bike to the nonprofit, which then raffles it off. You keep all the raffle proceeds for the nonprofit. Me as an event producer, it's all very tricky. And you have to understand those laws to do that. So New Belgium Brewing donates free swag to the nonprofit which I then give to people who register for the event, but they don't donate it to me because I'm a for-profit. That's how it works. But I raised $7,500 for trails this year with the help of New Belgium. So I got to help out trails.
Obvious work really hard. to make that work. I'm just-
I'm not complaining. I've just learned to live within the system. I get it. I understand it from that standpoint now. So I want to thank everybody. These are great
You
questions.
have books to
Thank
sell
you.
too.